Welcome to another deep dive. I'm incredibly glad you're joining us today because we have a truly mind-bending journey ahead of us.
It really is. It's one of those topics that just completely shifts your perspective.
Yeah, but before we even get into the sources, I want you to just visualize something for a second. Imagine you are marching into a completely industrialized war zone. You're facing down heavy artillery, thick mud.
The worst mud imaginable.
Right. And gas-actuated machine guns. And for those who don't know, those are weapons that actually use the energy of their own firing to load the next bullet. So they're capable of firing hundreds of rounds a minute. It is just a gray, mechanized nightmare.
Pure industrial slaughter.
Exactly. And you are walking into this nightmare wearing bright, conspicuous red pants and a shiny plumed helmet.
I mean, it sounds absurd to modern ears, right? It sounds like a terrible movie mistake or like a time traveler who just landed in the absolute worst possible place.
Yeah.
But for millions of men, that was an all too real historical reality.
It's wild. So today's source material is a comprehensive historical overview of the French Army in World War I. And the mission of this deep dive is to explore how an institution steeped in this very romantic, glorious 19th century tradition was forced to radically and often quite painfully evolve into a modern 20th century fighting force.
They were put under the absolute extreme pressure of a global conflict.
Yeah, and the result is this staggering collision of eras.
That collision really is the defining characteristic of the early war. Because the French army, at the outbreak of the conflict in 1914, they were fundamentally designed for a totally different kind of world. They were still carrying the cultural and military ghosts of Napoleon.
Right, the glorious charges.
Exactly. Their doctrine emphasized the offensive spirit, the bayonet charge, this core idea that sheer human willpower and courage could overcome literally any obstacle. But the technology of 1914 had entirely outpaced that romantic vision.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand the shock to the system, we really need to understand the sheer scale of what happened when the war started. What did the opening days actually look like for France?
The scale it's honestly difficult to comprehend today. When the order for mobilization was given on August 1st, 1914, France called up 3 million reservists immediately.
3 million. Just overnight.
Just overnight. Think about the societal impact of that. We're talking about men aged 24 to 38 simply dropping their pitchforks in the field.
Walking away from their factory lines.
Right, stepping away from their desks and picking up rifles. And by the end of the war, they had mobilized a total of 8.8 million men. And that actually included 900,000 colonial troops from across their empire.
That is an entire generation of men suddenly put into uniform.
Yeah.
But how did the military command actually plan to use all these people? Did they have a grand strategy for an army that size?
They did. It was known as Plan Nexipt, and the core idea relied heavily on the modern railroad network to rapidly mass troops on the eastern border with Germany. But the underlying philosophy of Plan 77 was something called the Élan Vital, or the vital spirit.
The vital spirit?
Right. It was an absolute, almost religious belief in the offensive at all costs. The plan essentially dictated launching aggressive, overwhelming attacks right into enemy territory, trusting that French bravery would just shatter the enemy lines.
Which brings us back to that incredible visual we started with. Because if your entire strategy is based on an overwhelming, glorious infantry charge...
You need to look glorious.
I guess your soldiers need to look glorious, yeah.
And what's fascinating here is the fatal clash between that aggressive mobilization doctrine and the physical reality of the uniforms those men were wearing. The French infantry went into the First World War wearing conspicuous blue coats and these bright matter red trousers.
It's hard to believe.
And the cavalry, specifically the cuirassiers, they were actually riding into battle wearing plumed helmets and polished metal breastplates that were almost unchanged from the Napoleonic period.
Wait, let me get this straight. You have soldiers stepping in front of modern rapid-fire machine guns while wearing shiny metal breastplates and bright red pants.
Yes.
How was that even possible? Didn't anyone in the military establishment look at the changing technology and see this coming?
There actually were several voices raising alarms. From 1903 onwards, there had been attempts to introduce a more practical, muted, camouflage-style field dress. But conservative opinion, both within the deeply traditional army and the general public, fiercely resisted the change.
They wanted the classic look.
Exactly. The red trousers, in particular, were a massive political debating point. They were viewed as a symbol of French national pride.
It seems insane to prioritize pride over camouflage when bullets are flying.
The former Minister of War, Adolphe Messimy, actually warned that this blind attachment to the most visible of colors would have cruel consequences. But he was overruled. His successor, Eugène Etienne, famously pushed back against the reformers, declaring in Parliament, "Abolish red trousers. Never. The red trousers are France."
The red trousers are France. That quote is chilling when you know what happens next. When you combine highly visible uniforms with peacetime training that emphasized attacking in tightly packed massed formations, the result just has to be a bloodbath.
It was catastrophic. In just the opening months of the war, during the massive collisions known as the Battle of the Frontiers, the French suffered a staggering 300,000 casualties.
Wow.
The doctrine of the glorious offensive just shattered against the reality of industrialized defense.
300,000 casualties in a few months. That is a mind-numbing number. Did that finally break the spell? How quickly did the military command realize they had to change course?
That level of catastrophic loss forced an immediate, frantic adaptation. The army realized very quickly that the red trousers were a literal death sentence. They stood out violently against the mud in the green fields. So by the first quarter of 1915, the military shifted to distributing a simplified horizon blue uniform.
Horizon blue. Was the thinking that they would blend in with the sky?
That was the idea, yes. And simultaneously, North African troops were issued a mustard khaki, which was much more practical for concealment. But perhaps the most telling rapid adaptation was regarding headgear.
Because initially, these men charging into artillery fire were just wearing cloth caps, right?
Simply cloth peppies. The first months of the conflict revealed a grim medical statistic. Surgeons noted that 77% of the wounds received by soldiers were head wounds from shrapnel.
77%.
And 80% of those specific cases were fatal. So to limit this horrific toll, the Army initially tried putting simple steel skull caps under the cloth hats. But by April 1915, a man named Colonel Adrian proposed a full helmet made of rolled steel.
The famous Adrian Helmet.
Exactly. It was ordered into production in June, and by December 1915, more than 3 million of these Adrian helmets had been manufactured and distributed.
Going from bright red pants and cloth caps to producing 3 million steel helmets in a matter of months. That really highlights the technological crucible these soldiers were thrown into. Which actually brings us to the weapons themselves. Our sources spent a lot of time on the French artillery, specifically the famous 75mm model 1897 field gun.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the 75mm gun perfectly illustrates the overarching problem of fighting the wrong war. In a vacuum, it was a brilliant piece of engineering. It was the backbone of their artillery, capable of firing an incredible 12 to 18 rounds a minute.
Which is incredibly fast.
It was designed for a mobile, open-field conflict where speed and accuracy were everything.
But the Western Front didn't stay a mobile, open-field conflict for very long. It locked down into hundreds of miles of deep trenches.
Precisely the issue. The 75mm was a flat trajectory weapon. It fired essentially straight ahead. But in a trench network, a light, flat trajectory field gun is far less effective. You can't blast apart a reinforced bunker or a deep earthwork by shooting straight at the dirt in front of it.
Ah, I see. So if the enemy is dug deep into the ground, you need something that lobs heavy shells high up into the air so they drop straight down into the trench from above.
Exactly. And this sudden realization caused a desperate scramble across the French military for heavy artillery and high-angle trench mortars. Early on, the situation was so dire, they actually pulled ancient 1838 Coehorn mortars out of museum storage.
Wait, really?
Yes, weapons dating back to just after the Napoleonic Wars, they took them to use in the trenches.
That is wild. They're fighting a 20th century industrialized war with museum pieces because their modern guns shoot too straight.
But again, the pressure of survival forced rapid innovation. They couldn't rely on museum pieces for long. They eventually developed highly effective weapons like the 81mm Brandt mortars, and the Brandt design was so revolutionary in its simplicity and effectiveness that it actually set the standard for almost all modern mortar designs that followed.
So they're learning by doing, at the cost of thousands of lives. Did the infantry weapons go through a similar brutal evolution?
Very much so. Let's look at machine guns. They started the war relying on the Saint-Étienne machine gun. In peacetime testing, it was fine. But the reality of the Western Front was mud, grit, and constant exposure. The Saint-Étienne proved incredibly fragile and prone to jamming, so they had to pivot to the much more robust, reliable Hotchkiss machine gun to defend their trenches.
But a heavy machine gun just sits in one place. If your whole strategy is eventually going back on the offensive, how do you cross no man's land? You can't carry a massive Hotchkiss with you while you're running.
That was the tactical puzzle. They realized they needed firepower that could actually move with the attacking troops, so they introduced the shot light machine gun. Now, the Chauchat has a mixed historical reputation regarding its reliability, but doctrinally, it was a massive leap. It gave individual infantry squads mobile automatic fire.
The real insight here isn't just the guns themselves. It's that France had to invent modern infantry squad tactics on the fly. By creating the Chauchat light machine gun, they realized firepower couldn't just sit in a bunker. It had to move with the men. They were inventing modern mobile warfare through trial and error in the mud.
It is like watching a century of military doctrine compress into roughly 3 years. But unfortunately, that rapid technological acceleration also brought about some of the most horrifying innovations in human history. We have to discuss the reality of chemical warfare.
Yeah, it's hard to even think about. Now, the source notes something surprising. France actually used chemical weapons first.
They did. They launched tear gas grenades against the German army in August 1914. It was intended to harass, not kill.
But the escalation from tear gas to lethal chemicals happened very fast, didn't it?
Yes. Germany had a massive chemical industry and a virtual monopoly on the production of halogens like chlorine and bromine. They introduced deadly chlorine gas at the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915, and the gas physically destroyed a soldier's lungs from the inside.
And no one had gas masks. How do you even defend against an invisible cloud of poison that you've never seen before?
The initial French defenses were incredibly crude and desperate. Soldiers were instructed to use pads soaked with bicarbonate of soda, or in many cases, to urinate on a cloth and breathe through that, hoping the ammonia would neutralize the chlorine.
That is just bleak.
It was a nightmare. Eventually, this evolved into sophisticated equipment like the ARS gas masks by 1917, which actually provided genuine protection. But the learning curve was steep and the toll was heavy. France suffered roughly 190,000 chemical warfare casualties by the end of the conflict.
It's horrifying to imagine. You're dealing with artillery bombardments, machine guns, knee-deep mud, and then an invisible cloud of poison drifting into your trench.
Yeah.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Amidst all this horror and defensive stalemate, a completely new type of weapon is born to try and break the deadlock. The tank.
Yes, the land ships.
Yeah.
General Jean-Baptiste Eugène Estienne was a visionary who persuaded the High Command to begin production of armored tracked vehicles in early 1916. The idea was to create a machine that could crush barbed wire, cross trenches, and shield infantry from machine gun fire.
So they finally roll out these tanks in 1917. Did it actually break the deadlock?
It was an absolute disaster. They debuted these new weapons in April 1917 at the Second Battle of the Aisne. They deployed 128 tanks.
What went wrong?
Almost everything. They lost 76 of those 128 tanks almost immediately. The early designs were bulky, incredibly slow, and presented huge targets. Most of them were simply hit by German artillery and burned on the battlefield, while others just broke down in the thick mud before they even reached the enemy lines.
That sounds incredibly demoralizing. But they didn't scrap the project. How did they fix it?
They realized that making massive, lumbering land ships wasn't the answer. They partnered with the industrialist Louis Renault to create a lighter, faster, more agile tank. By 1918, they introduced the Renault FT. This was a massive leap forward. It was the first production tank to feature a fully rotating turret on top, allowing the gun to fire in any direction while the tank moved forward.
That is the basic design DNA of almost every single tank used in the world today. It's just wild how they went from Napoleonic cavalry and breastplates to modern armored warfare in 4 years. But we can't just talk about all this metal and machinery without talking about the human beings operating it. Because by 1916 and 1917, the French soldiers were being pushed into a literal meat grinder.
The human toll under Commander Joseph Joffre in the early years was immense, but nothing encapsulates the sheer, grinding attrition of this war quite like the Battle of Verdun in 1916. The German general Erich von Falkenhayn explicitly designed his attack on Verdun not with the goal of capturing strategic territory, but with a cold calculus, to bleed France white.
Just to inflict casualties.
Yes. It was envisioned purely as a battle of attrition, to kill so many Frenchmen that the country would simply collapse.
And the French response was led by General Philippe Pétain. He famously declared that there would be no more withdrawals, that they shall not pass. But the logistics of actually holding Verdun are baffling. How did they sustain a defense in a place designed to just chew up soldiers?
Pétain realized that if he left units in the Verdun sector for too long, they would be completely annihilated. So he instituted a system of constant rotation. He rotated an unbelievable 259 out of the 330 total French infantry regiments through that single sector.
Think about the emotional weight of that. Almost the entire French army was funneled through the hell of Verdun at some point, and they were supplied by just a single open road for trucks, right?
Yes, a constant unbroken chain of trucks moving day and night, bringing up shells and fresh men and bringing back the wounded. It became known as the Sacred Way. While Verdun was technically a defensive victory because the lines held, the losses were astronomical on both sides. The French army was deeply, fundamentally exhausted.
You would think the high command would recognize that exhaustion. But instead, in 1917, they get a new commander-in-chief, Robert Nivelle. And from the source material, it sounds like he promised the moon.
Nivelle was extremely charismatic and convinced the government he had the formula for a quick, decisive victory. He championed a tactic called the creeping barrage.
For those of us who aren't military historians, what exactly is a creeping barrage?
Basically, the artillery fires a continuous curtain of exploding shells that slowly moves or creeps forward across the battlefield at a set pace. The infantry walks right behind it, using the moving wall of explosions as a shield to cover their advance until they reach the enemy trenches. Nivelle promised that with this tactic, he would break the German lines and end the war in 48 hours.
But 48 hours turned into a nightmare. The Nivelle offensive in April 1917 didn't end the war. Instead, it delivered 134,000 French casualties in just the first 9 days.
This raises an important question. What happens to an institution when the humans comprising it are pushed past their absolute psychological and physical limits? The answer came in the spring of 1917 with the French Army mutinies.
Following that disastrous Nivelle offensive, soldiers simply refused to attack. We're talking about over 35,000 soldiers across 68 different divisions saying, "We are done."
Now, it is crucial to understand the historical consensus on these mutinies as presented in the source material. We must be entirely impartial here. This wasn't simply a case of mass cowardice or a sudden wave of pacifism. The soldiers weren't throwing down their weapons and refusing to defend their country. Rather, historians liken these mutinies to a political labor strike.
A labor strike in the middle of a war.
Yes, the soldiers were motivated by profound despair. They had realized that mass infantry offensives would never prevail over modern machine guns and artillery. They demanded peace, yes, but they also demanded practical structural changes. Better food, more leave to see their families, and most importantly, an absolute end to suicidal charges against unbroken defenses.
So it was a strike against the management of the war, against the generals treating their lives as expendable, rather than a refusal to protect France itself.
Precisely. And the High Command, now under Philippe Pétain once again, had to resolve this crisis incredibly carefully. If the Germans realized the extent of the mutiny, they could have marched to Paris. Pétain essentially restored trust through a careful mix of strict discipline and genuine reform.
How do you discipline 35,000 mutinying men with weapons?
You don't. You make examples. Yes, there were widespread courts-martial and 49 documented executions of ringleaders to demonstrate the absolute authority of the command. But crucially, Pétain also listened to the strikers. He stopped the large-scale, pointless attacks. He instituted regular rest rotations for frontline units, allowed furloughs so men could go home, and drastically improved the living conditions, the trenches, and the food for the soldiers.
He treated them like human beings, recognizing that there is a breaking point. But how do you go from a paralyzed, mutinying army in 1917 to actually winning the war in 1918? That transition seems impossible.
It required a slow, delicate rebuilding of trust. And they were bolstered by a massive shift in morale when American troops began arriving in large numbers. But the real unifying moment was born of pure desperation. In the spring of 1918, Germany launched the Kaiserschlacht, the massive spring offensive. It was their last desperate roll of the dice to win the war before the Americans could fully deploy.
And the sheer panic of that massive German push forced the Allies to finally work together efficiently.
Yes, the Allied command finally unified under French General Ferdinand Foch. The French army absorbed the brunt of that massive German offensive, bending but not breaking. And once the German advance exhausted itself, Foch launched the decisive grand offensive coordinating French, British, and American forces. During this last victorious stage of the war, French forces alone captured some 140,000 prisoners.
So they pull off this incredible victory, but the French army that achieves that victory in 1918, what does it actually look like compared to the army that marched out in August 1914?
Structurally, it is unrecognizable. The transformation from a 19th century mindset to a modern force was complete. By 1918, a staggering 40% of all French soldiers on the Western Front were not carrying rifles, they were operating artillery. The reliance on the individual infantrymen had drastically decreased. In 1915, there were 1.5 million French infantry troops. By 1918, that number had dropped to 850,000.
Because machines had taken over. The Renault tanks, the expanded Air Force, the massive proliferation of mortars and machine guns. The technology finally replaced the need for endless lines of men charging with bayonets. But the cost of living that lesson, the final statistics in our source material, are just devastating.
They truly are. Over the course of the 4-year war, France called up roughly 8.8 million men. Of those, they suffered around 6 million casualties. That includes 1.4 million dead and 4.2 million wounded.
That represents roughly 71% of all those who fought. A 71% casualty rate for an entire generation. And there's one specific statistic from the source that really hit me hard. Out of the 1 million French infantrymen who died in the entire war, more than half of them perished before November 1915.
That is the most brutal metric of the learning curve we've been discussing today. The absolute majority of the infantry deaths occurred in those first 15 months. They died while the army was still figuring out how to survive in a modern, industrialized war. Once the steel helmets, the heavy artillery, the better squad tactics, and the mechanization were finally integrated, the death rate for the infantry fell significantly, even though the war continued for 3 more grueling years.
So what does this all mean? How do we take this massive, harrowing historical event and connect it to you listening right now? The metaphor of the red trousers is haunting. It asks a really uncomfortable question of all of us. What outdated, comfortable paradigms are our institutions clinging to today simply because that's how it's always been done? The French army paid in blood to learn that nostalgia is a death sentence in the face of shifting technology. True resilience isn't just about taking a beating, it's about looking at the reality of the trench in front of you, adapting to it, and listening to the people suffering on the front lines.
I think that is the perfect synthesis. The French Army's journey from a romantic cavalry-focused mindset to a modern, mechanized, combined arms force is a masterclass in painful but absolutely necessary evolution. They entered the war with the tragic misunderstanding of modern firepower, but through unimaginable sacrifice, they innovated armor, aviation, indirect fire tactics, and logistics to eventually emerge victorious.
It really is a story of incredible, albeit tragic, resilience. But I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. Building on the sheer scale of what we've discussed today. Think about that staggering statistic we mentioned. A 71% casualty rate, over 1.4 million dead. When an institution or an entire nation loses such a massive, staggering portion of its people to the meat grinder of progress, how does the ghost of that immense trauma rewire its culture, its politics, and its appetite for conflict for generations to come? How do you rebuild a society when so many of the young men who were supposed to build it are simply gone?
That is a profound question, and it is the question that defined the entire remainder of the 20th century.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you walk away today with a new perspective on history, the mechanics of innovation, and the deeply human cost of progress. Until next time, keep exploring.